Let me read you a little bit more from Tim Snyder on the rule of law. A modern democratic state depends upon the rule of law. Before anything else is possible, we have to endorse the principle that we are all governed by law and that our institutions are grounded in law. This enables a functional government of a specific sort in which leaders can be regularly replaced by elections. It allows us to live as free individuals within a set of rules that we can alter together. The rule of law depends on people who believe in the spirit of law. Matt Gaetz, the proposed Attorney General, is the opposite of such a person. It is not just that he flouts the law himself spectacularly and disgustingly. It is that he embodies lawlessness and can be counted upon to abuse the law to pursue Trump's political opponents. The end of the rule of law is an essential component of a regime change. And then just to underscore Tim Snyder's point and John Heilmann's, here's how a Republican, former House member, now Senator, describes Matt Gaetz's conduct. And I play this because it's also been revealed today that Speaker Mike Johnson doesn't plan to release the ethics report into Matt Gaetz. But a lot of the conduct is known. This is a Republican senator.
There's a reason why no one in the conference came and defended him, because we had all seen the videos he was showing on the House floor that all of us had walked away of the girls that he had slept with. He'd brag about how he would crush ED medicine and chase it with an energy drink so he could go all night.
So it's important because to John Heilmann's point, this is about humiliating the Senate Republicans and either making them confirm that guy who, in the telling of another Republicans, would, quote, show videos on the House floor of all the girls he slept with. He'd brag about how he would crush ED medicine and chase it with an energy drink so he could go all night, end quote. It's about either making them confirm him or taking away all their power and confirming him without them in a recess appointment. What is the impact of that on the rule of law?
Tremendous evisceration of the rule of law. And it shows, Nicole, that the paradigm in this country has shifted from a right versus left paradigm to an insider-outsider paradigm. The Republican voices have been very strongly critical of Matt Gaetz, his own caucus apparently glad to see him go. Nonetheless, he's nominated as Attorney General. It shows, again, that the goal is deconstruction, evisceration of the rule of law. This notion that there's some sort of institutional Washington that's beyond party but is sort of incumbency or those that are in charge versus everyone else, and the president-elect positioning himself on the side of everyone else, that's a new ball game. Again, not we don't agree on policy or the right versus the left. Insider-outsider has the potential as a conflict to really erode institutions like the rule of law.
And so what happens? I mean, are you afraid that they'll come looking for you because of your role in the January 6 hearings?
I think there's no question that asking questions or launching investigations, even meritless ones, has consequences. Absolutely. It could be expensive and time-consuming and difficult for people who have done absolutely nothing wrong but exercise the authority that has been given them through official channels. Would have to go through those investigations. I'm not worried ultimately on criminal or other exposure. I am worried about inconvenience and expense and intimidation by the launching of those kinds of investigations.
Mike Schmidt, you've done some incredible reporting on Trump's ambitions in his first term to use the Justice Department to retaliate against his political enemies, and you've chronicled the roadblocks that he encountered. How does Gaetz, and if we're to presume another ally at the FBI, how do they eradicate those hurdles?
Well, Trump basically ran into two problems with weaponizing the Justice Department. One was having an attorney general that would go along with what he wanted. As Bill Barr writes in his book, Trump is complaining to him in December of 2020 that he never prosecuted Jim Comey. That was something that Trump tried to do throughout his entire presidency. It was something that Trump tried to do himself in 2018. He wanted to go out and prosecute Comey himself, even though Trump's not a prosecutor. So that was the first roadblock. The second roadblock that they ran into was the courts. In that case, they ran into the courts in the case of Andy McCabe. Andy McCabe, the former deputy FBI director, was under investigation. They took his case to a grand jury, and the grand jury came back and said they weren't going to indict him. That was a roadblock there. They didn't. There were no charges to be brought against McCabe because of that. The first, with Gates at the top of the Justice Department, that roadblock that Barr had created on the issue of Comey would be gone. I don't think I'm taking too many leaps here to say that Matt Gaetz is someone who would go along with exactly what Donald Trump wanted. That is essentially what Matt Gaetz's brand is. I was reading back some of the stories that we had done about the investigations into Gaetz, and I saw that the way that Trump first talked to Gaetz was that he saw him on Fox News in late 2017 railing against the Mueller investigation. And he called him and said, that he needed warriors or, something of that sort to help him in his efforts. And that's exactly what Gaetz did. So I think what you may see, which would be different, is more interaction between the Justice Department, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, where the Justice Department would try to do things and the courts would be forced to really weigh in and determine whether there is merit to what the department is doing. And we saw that in the Andy McCabe case, but in most cases, the investigations that Trump wanted were sort of never really got out the door at the Justice Department. They never really got to charges. There were just investigations. And to Tim's point, there is an enormous amount that can be done on the investigative front if the department wants to investigate something or someone. And there are not a lot of checks on that in many ways. They can interview people. They can send out subpoenas. If they want to get a search warrant, they have to go to the courts. But I think you would see here more as a clash of the branches. You would see the Justice Department trying to do things and the judicial branch being forced to come and weigh in and say whether they thought it was okay or not.